Carroll, stand-up community subscribers and listeners from around the globe. It's time to Stand Up with Pete Dominic, where we ask the important questions that impact you, your family, and your community. Such as, will this stubbed toe ruin my vacation unless I slather it in locally available coconut oil?
That's right.
And will my uncle in Florida finally do the right thing and get vaccinated and also hook me up with some of that sweet southern morphine?
That's right.
And now, the podcast host who struggles in family vacation photos to not look like the Uber driver, Pete Dominic.
Oh, thank you very much, Pete Co. Great to be back here in the shed and having you with the original openings. Always great. I love it. And yeah, the family vacation photos, I don't know if it was going to be offensive if I said, do I look gay in this? I debated it. My daughter told me not to tweet it. But, I mean, I don't look straight, at least. I could say that. I looked at myself and I was like, yeah, here I am with these three beautiful women, my wife and daughters, and a lot of people were unconvinced that I was the father and husband in that situation, based on my pose and appearance. Anyway, check out those photos on my Twitter and Facebook from our vacation. We had an excellent vacation, and it's great to be back. We went to Cancun, Mexico, Club Med, and it was because Val got a gig there. That's why. We otherwise, I don't think, would have been able to afford that or justify paying for such a ritzy trip. But we used miles, and Val taught 2 yoga classes a day, and she was the hit of the place. And so Val and I and the girls had an amazing vacation thanks to my partner, Valerie Vendrami. Follow her on Facebook and find her on Instagram, but she's more active on Facebook because she's awesome, and we had just a great time. And I'll just say this before we get started on the show. I'm very excited to have Matthew Ho joining me. It's all about Afghanistan today. Hope you're following and learning and thinking about all of that. But the first night we were there, I sat down alone on the beach and just started whimpering and crying because I was so excited to be there and finally be away after 2 years with Val and the girls. When I got canned or they didn't renew me at Sirius, I kind of thought, like, in my worst moments, that vacations were over, that we wouldn't be able to, go on nice vacations anymore, which is something that we always did. We don't spend a lot of money. We don't have a lot of money, but we always went. Val's belief is that materialistic things aren't nearly as important or as valuable or rewarding as experiences and making memories. And so we've always been more focused on that and spent a lot on those trips. But I thought that those were over, but they aren't, because Val came up big, and I've worked really hard to build this podcast and this community, and we're doing well, and it's really going okay for us right now. And so it was a great vacation. I relaxed, totally relaxed. I read and I wrote. I read Stillness is the Key by Ryan Holiday, and I read Spencer Ackerman's amazing new book that I highly recommend that you get if you care at all about national security. His new book is called Reign of Terror. And I saw that MSNBC's Chris Hayes was also on vacation and reading the book. Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. He's actually going to be on the show Thursday. I'm interviewing him Wednesday, so he'll join me hopefully on Thursday. I'll post that one. But so that's what I did. And I wrote journal entries, and I relaxed a lot. It was awesome. Made some new friends. Hello to the Levies from Northern California. And it was just great. The girls had a great time. So thank you very much for all of your support and getting me there. Couldn't do it without the listeners and the paid subscribers of this program. Very, very flattered, honored, and excited to have you. Tomorrow I got some pretty exciting news that I will break to you one way or another. That news is of a personal nature, of a potential political campaign nature. How about that for a teaser? I'll tweet more about it and share with you on the podcast on Tuesday's show when I get a kind of conclusion to see what's going to happen. Pretty exciting, though. Very looking forward to telling you about it. But today's show is all about Afghanistan. I wanted to have a conversation with my friend Matthew Ho, who's a veteran and former State Department representative in Afghanistan, who resigned from his post as the senior civilian representative in several provinces, but the last one was Zabul province. And that's how I met him, through his resignation, where all of the country found out about Matt and his integrity, and he resigned against better advice of some pretty important people at the time. But I have so much respect for Matt. We became really good friends over the years. He has had his own personal struggle, very public, with his issues with addiction and suicide and more. And Matt's really great. He's now at the Center for International Policy. I'll tell you more about him coming up when we have that conversation. But I also wanted to just grab several clips regarding Afghanistan. We could certainly talk about COVID and climate and the Field of Dreams baseball game in Iowa the other night, where my very close friend Kevin Costner came to throw out the first pitch and celebrate the 30 years since Field of Dreams premiered. But I wanted to give you as much context as I could on Afghanistan. So now it's time to do an audio roundup of some of the commentary about the war in Afghanistan and it concluding, really, in terms of America's commitment to it, pulling out, and the Taliban back where they were 20 years ago in charge of Afghanistan on 9/11. It's a very historic and important week and a lot of different opinions and nuance, so I wanted to give you as much as I could on that, and then we'll get to a longer, deeper conversation with Matthew Ho. It's time for The Last 24. Yeah, July was the hottest month on record, and COVID, as a result of the Delta variant and the anti-vax movement, continues to spike. How much more of this can we take is the question to ask. Lots of headlines, school closures, school openings, controversy seemingly at every school board about masks. So there's so much to discuss about that. Those are clearly, I think, the most consequential issues. But if you live in Afghanistan, that right now is the story. The Taliban's lightning fast takeover of provincial capitals and now the nation's capital, Kabul, has been shocking and yet predictable in some ways in some circles. All personnel have been evacuated from the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. They're now at the airport as of just before midnight on Sunday, according to the State Department. Crowds packing the international airport in Kabul in a chaotic scene after Taliban insurgents entered the Afghan capital, and President Ashraf Ghani fled the country, saying he wanted to avoid bloodshed. And it's just so sad and terrifying to see the Taliban retake this country and bring them yet again back to the 4th century where they seem to be living in. And then the least important consequence, I would say, is the political consequence, the domestic politics, which have always driven decision-making at the highest levels regarding the Afghan campaign and everything surrounding the region, national security, and so much more. But those political considerations, of course, listening to pundits and commentators talk about what it means for Joe Biden and Democrats or Republicans, the least consequential, but a few things to play for you on that as well. So let's get it started with Jake Tapper's questioning of Secretary of State Antony Blinken on CNN's State of the Union Sunday.
State Antony Blinken. Secretary Blinken, thanks so much for joining us. Take a listen to what President Biden was saying less than 6 weeks ago.
Your own intelligence community has assessed that the Afghan government will likely collapse.
That is not true. They did not reach that conclusion. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of a embassy. The likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely.
Secretary Blinken, as you know, the Taliban has closed in on Kabul. We're evacuating the embassy, burning documents. Biden increased troops, deploying to the country twice in 3 days just to rescue those there. This is not just about the overall idea of leaving Afghanistan. This is about leaving hastily and ineptly. Secretary Blinken, how did President Biden get this so wrong?
Jake, first, let's put this in context. And as we've discussed before, we were in Afghanistan for one overriding purpose, to deal with the folks who attacked us on 9/11. That's why we went there 20 years ago. And over those 20 years, we brought bin Laden to justice. We vastly diminished the threat posed by al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to the United States, to the point where it's not capable of conducting such an attack again from Afghanistan. We're going to keep in place in the region the capacity to see if any reemergence of a terrorist threat and to be able to deal with it. And on the terms that we went into Afghanistan in the first place, we've succeeded in achieving our objectives. When the president came to office, he had a decision to make. The previous administration negotiated an agreement with the Taliban that said that our forces, our remaining forces, only about 2,500, would be out of the country on May 1st. And the idea that the status quo could have been maintained by keeping our forces there, I think is simply wrong. The fact of the matter is, had the president decided to keep forces in Afghanistan beyond May 1st, attacks would have resumed on our forces. The Taliban had not been attacking our forces or NATO during the period from which the agreement was reached to May 1st. The offensive you're seeing across the country now to take these provincial capitals would have commenced.
Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, under tough questioning from Jake Tapper, I recommend watching that whole interview. Staying with CNN, Jim Acosta had the former governor of California, Jerry Brown, on. He defended President Biden's handling of the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan.
And you mentioned Afghanistan. I want to ask you about this, Governor Brown, because you've been in politics for decades. You remember Vietnam. You remember how that ended there. What are your thoughts about what we're seeing right now in Afghanistan? What would be your advice to President Biden right now?
Well, Biden was very courageous, and there's so much hypocrisy. Look, the Afghan war, very soon after we went over there, it was over. We got rid of we took out the al-Qaeda, we chased after bin Laden. We stayed there too long. Bush should have gotten us out. Obama should have gotten us out. Trump, but they were all afraid of exactly what's happening. They didn't have the guts that Joe Biden had. Now, maybe his army didn't tell him how bad it was. I mean, after all, John Kennedy was fooled by the CIA and his army when he launched the Bay of Pigs. That was an utter disaster. Vietnam, yeah, they were climbing off the roof because evidently the CIA and the army didn't tell them. So these foreign adventures in totally different cultures are really not good. So we've got to strengthen the home base, make prudent actions abroad, and terminate them as soon as possible. Look, this was not a war that was fought. It wasn't being fought. It was, we had firepower to kill Taliban. But our friends, our allies, gave up. They didn't have a rationale. Their only rationale was America there, and they were fighting. But when push comes to shove, they are more aligned with the Taliban, or at least they're not willing to die for them. So obviously Biden had to get out. What, we're going to stay another 20 years? Joe Biden will be attacked by the very people that got us in there and got us to stay in there. And that's the key variable. We've been there for 3 presidents. Why didn't they do anything? Because they're afraid. They're afraid exactly what happened. How do you get out of a quagmire? It's not pretty. But at least Biden has taken the step. And the next step is to think through, how do we get in these messes? What new messes are waiting for us in our 800 bases at absolute overextension, where we're meddling all over the world and we're not taking care of business at home at our own border with Mexico.
All right, former California Governor Jerry Brown launching a vociferous defense of Joe Biden. Well, here is the reverse of that. A brutal attack from one of the most evil and powerful men ever to lead the United States State Department. And there's been a bunch of bad ones. This is the Trump Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. He came under tough questioning from Chris Wallace over on Fox News. And I just want to play a couple minutes of this awful disgrace of a man's response to give you yet more context.
President Biden released a statement yesterday in which, in effect, he blamed President Trump and your administration for the deal that you made with the Taliban back in 2020, which resulted in a promise at that time, if President Trump had stayed in office, to pull all troops out by this past May. I want to read you some of what President Biden said in his statement. When I became president, I faced a choice: follow through on the deal or ramp up our presence and send more American troops to fight once again in another country's civil conflict. Mr. Secretary, what do you think of President Biden's attempt here to pin all the blame for what's transpired in these last few weeks on the deal he says he, quote, inherited from President Trump and from you.
If the risks weren't so serious, Chris, it'd be pathetic. I wouldn't have let my 10-year-old son get away from this kind of pathetic blame shifting.
Oh, God help that poor boy.
He should be less focused on trying to blame this on someone else than to solving the problem of making sure that we protect and defend American security. Chris, it's worth noting this did not happen on our watch. We reduced our forces significantly. The Taliban didn't advance on capitals all across Afghanistan. So it's just a plain old fact that this is happening under the Biden administration's leadership now, almost a quarter of a way into his first term. This is not the way leaders lead, by pointing backwards.
All right, that's enough from the former Secretary of State who met with the Taliban and negotiated with the Taliban, including a release of thousands of Taliban prisoners who are now fighting against the Afghan forces, whatever's left of them, and people. But let's go back to CNN, where contributor and presidential historian Tim Naftali was asked if it was fair to compare the fall of Saigon to Kabul's descent into chaos. Here is now back to, they play on the CNN clip, both a couple of anchors, I think ABC News, as well as Jake Tapper, asking the current Secretary of State what he thought about the comparison to the fall of Saigon. So you'll hear that, and then you'll hear presidential historian Tim Naftali arguing that he thinks it's fair to compare the fall of Saigon to Kabul's descent into chaos.
President Biden is intent on avoiding a Saigon moment. That's a reference, of course, to the hasty and humiliating U.S. evacuation from Vietnam. But with this troop surge to airlift Americans out of Afghanistan, aren't we already in the midst of a Saigon moment?
No, we're not. Remember, this is not Saigon. We went to Afghanistan 20 years ago with one mission, and that mission was to deal with the folks who attacked us on 9/11.
Isn't that exactly what we're seeing now? I mean, even the images are evocative of what happened in Vietnam.
Let's take a step back. This is manifestly not Saigon.
So, Tim, is it a fair comparison?
I think it's a very fair comparison. I believe that the Secretary of State, I can understand the argument the Secretary of State is making. It's a fair argument. But as Americans, we know that there have been several missions in Afghanistan, that the initial mission, which was to destroy al-Qaeda and to destroy the regime that gave a safe haven to Osama bin Laden, that mission wasn't fully accomplished before we found ourselves in Iraq. In a sense, Iraq allowed us to take our eyes off the ball in Afghanistan. And afterwards, we played catch-up. And I think a series of presidents never fully grasped, never fully decided what our mission would be. Was it nation building? Was it the creation of civil society? Was it destroying the Taliban after destroying al-Qaeda? I think there was strategic confusion.
Yeah, there is strategic confusion from the generals who wanted to lie about the progress, from the Afghan corrupt government who wanted to lie about the numbers of men they had signed up and whether or not they were paying them. It was the interest of the private contractors who influenced the perpetuation of that war so they could get government money. There's so much that matters here that should go into a discussion about that war, why it was fought, why we stayed, why we got it all so wrong for so long, and what we could have done with all of the money that was spent there. Jared Yates Sexton tweeting, just a reminder, as our aging, crumbling, inhumane system of healthcare sways and buckles under the weight of a pandemic, that the disastrous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq cost us trillions of dollars that could have been used to modernize the whole thing. Not to mention, of course, the lives lost on all sides of this conflict, the thousands of American servicemen and hundreds of thousands of civilians caught in between it all, and just the sadness of the Taliban taking over again. It's just so hard to take and to watch and to see. One of the most difficult outcomes and concerns is what will happen to the women and girls who have made so much progress in that country over the past 20 years. International human rights and civil rights attorney Kimberly Motley spent years on the ground in Afghanistan working as a lawyer for Afghan women. She's outraged that we are abandoning those very women. Here she is on MSNBC with my friend Ali Velshi.
I mean, the lightning speed at which the Taliban is taking over this country is appalling. It's not a matter now of if they'll take it over, it's when. And we can stop this, and we should stop this, because this is a humanitarian nuclear bomb that we have unfortunately been a part of, and we need to do something. We have a responsibility to do something.
Tell me about the situation of women in Afghanistan. We've all heard about it anecdotally, but you were actually there. Tell me what was happening in the last few years with women.
Well, with women, what we've seen, for instance, with programs such as Michelle Obama's Let Girls Learn program, before we went there 20 years ago, there weren't any girls in school. For the last 5 years, there's been over 80,000 girls that have benefited from that program. For that specific program with Michelle Obama, those girls will be entering the 12th grade.
Wow.
If the Taliban come in, that's done. That's done. No girls in schools, girls being enslaved, that's it.
Good Lord, do I want her to be wrong, but no part of me can imagine, honestly, that she is. It really is a humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan, and I'm just not sure if there were any good outcomes. How long were we going to stay there? In perpetuity? At some point, we were going to leave, and this was inevitably, sadly, going to happen. Seems to be the conclusion that so many people are coming to. If you aren't coming to that conclusion, if you've heard other insightful opinions, including from international analysts, Afghan people themselves, I would like to talk to them. So let me know who you're hearing. I'm looking forward to learning more and talking more about what our responsibility would have been, should have been, could have been in Afghanistan post 9/11 in the attacks that took place in our country, which I followed so closely and have interviewed so many of the most important people in the middle of it, the authors and journalists, the politicians, the activists, the veterans, of course. And so much of my interest lies in this country and our history and relationship with it. So I'm certainly going to continue discussing it and thinking about it. And I'd love to hear from you on it as well. But those are just a few perspectives. I'll give you more, but I want to get to a few other headlines and my guest today. So it's now time for the news dump.
Alligator eats your arm, leaving just a stump. Allows permission to cry for today's news dump.
Yes. Oh, dear. Yeah. There were crocodiles in Mexico that had attacked people, which meant no more water skiing, which I was really looking forward to at the Club Med there. But yeah, apparently there's a lot of crocodiles in the Gulf Coast, in the Yucatan Peninsula. I did not know that before we went there, but that was a little bit scary. Anyway, let's get to the headlines. Like I said, COVID and Afghanistan are what seems to be dominating the news, as it should. But some of the other stories that I've been watching or reading a little bit about. Over the weekend, there was a major anti-vax protest in Southern California. A man was stabbed at that. Probably look for more of those. I think I want to go to one. I'm pretty fed up right now. I want to get in a fight with a guy wearing a helmet over vaccines. I mean, I want to. I won't, but I want to. In Las Vegas, a grocery storefront collapsed at opening time. 4 people were hurt. A storefront collapsed into rubble. Firefighters pulled one person from wood planking and roof debris at this store on the Las Vegas Strip, and that person and 3 others were taken to hospital for treatment. Not immediately clear how many people were in the building when it happened, but that's some pretty bad luck right there. You know, you're just walking in the store and it just collapses. The only thing worse would be if it was a store you were embarrassed to be walking into. Like, what if me, a 45-year-old grown adult, was walking into Abercrombie and Fitch and the Fitch just fell on me? I think that would would add real insult to actual injury. Luckily, no one was hurt, but it's one of those every day is a gift reminder stories for an earthquake killing several people in Haiti over the weekend, then a 6.9 earthquake striking off Alaska. That is your earthquake update. Really important to pay attention to what's happening in Haiti. I like the organization Partners in Health. If you're looking to donate, I highly recommend them. Torrential rain in Japan causing more floods and mudslides. But here's some good news. The United States Department of Agriculture, which is responsible for the food stamp SNAP program, has permanently boosted benefits by 25%. The Biden administration responsible for this, proving the significant and permanent increase in the levels of food stamp assistance available to needy families, the largest single increase in the program's history. That will probably go undercovered and underreported. The aid boost first reported by the New York Times. And finally, before we get to my very important and serious conversation with veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, Matthew Ho, I did just see this. Here is President Trump demanding that Joe Biden resign. Wow.
So I think that Sleepy Joe, the fake president, we call him the trespasser in chief, I think he should, I think he should resign. I think what he's doing is a total disgrace. You know, our translators, and by the way, I'm not so big into translators. I think whatever later you were at birth is what you should be. But apparently they're not being too nice to our translators, and we don't like that. And, I made a small deal with Fat Mike Pompeo. That's what we called him. He kept getting fat. I was like, you look like you're going to become Chris Christie soon, Mike. And we made a quiet little deal with the Taliban because, I'll talk to anybody. I'll make deals. I used to text with some of the Taliban people.
What?
And, we'd joke and they'd say to me, sir. They called me sir. They'd say, sir. They don't call Sleepy Joe sir, but they called me sir. Game, respect, game. But they would say to me, sir, have you assaulted any women today? And I would say, to quote City Slickers, day ain't over yet. And they would laugh and then do violence on people. But we had a strong, respectful relationship with the Taliban. And Fat Pompeo and I made a nice little deal with them that was totally okay. And then Sleepy Joe, I don't even think he's doing it. I think somebody told him to do it. But he's totally messing it up. He's messed up the Trump economy. Now he's messed up Trump Afghanistan. That's what we're trying to call our property there. I worked out with the Taliban that I could maybe build there have a lot of mountains. Not a lot of people know that, but they have a lot of mountains in Afghanistan. I thought, let's get a nice sort of 5-star property. One of those mountains. Can you believe those views? Okay, unbelievable. But, we don't agree with everything they're doing. Okay, I think the hot women should be able to go to schools. Okay, we're still, if I was president, we'd be like, all the 9s and 10s go to school, but not under Sleepy Joe. We're going to have no hot women in Afghanistan learn places. So we'll see what happens.
Always great from JL Covan. And now it is time to get to today's guests. And just so you know, behind the scenes, been a pretty crazy weekend, a lot happening. Only got the opportunity to do one interview for tomorrow, and Mara Mondays didn't take place because she was out this weekend. And then Monday, I'm traveling all day, so I'm not even sure who I'm going to be able to get to for Tuesday's program. But so it's been just a bit crazy, but I'll get back to 2 guests a day, hopefully each and every day here on the show. But today's guest is a really special guest. He's a senior fellow now at the Center for International Policy. Is 12 years experience with America's wars overseas, the United States Marine Corps. He is a Marine. Also worked for the Department of Defense and State Department. Oh, the stories he has. Matt and I have gotten really close over the years, and he resigned in protest from his post in Afghanistan with the State Department over the American escalation of the war in 2009. The Washington Post printed his resignation letter, and he was pretty much appeared on almost every major media outlet. And prior to his assignment in Afghanistan, he took part in the American occupation of Iraq, first in 2004 to 5, and then later on in 2006 and 7 as a Marine Corps company commander. So Matthew Ho has been on pretty much every single major news outlet. He is a great writer, and a great guy and a great friend of mine. You can now find him back on social media. He quit, and now he is back at Matthew P. Ho, and I would really love if you contacted him there. Also, check out his website, MatthewHo.com. Oh, and he's going to join us at the Hangout this week. I invited him. Here we go.
No, it's so good to see you again, Pete, to talk with you. You know, I wish circumstances, of course, were different, right? I mean, everything that's happening is so tragic and catastrophic. But yeah, no, it's really good to hear your voice and see you again, man.
There's several people I want to talk to this week, but you were the first person I wanted to really connect with. And let's just remind everybody about your personal experience, your professional experience in Afghanistan. If memory serves, you were like the senior civilian representative in a province in Afghanistan, and that's basically like the United States State Department lead person in that province. Tell me about, how you got that job and what that job was. Was it in Zabul province? Was that the name?
It was in Zabul. And before I was in Zabul, I actually had been in the Northeast, and I was the acting political advisor to a U.S. Army brigade. So up in the Northeast for a period of a couple months, I was the lead State Department representative for 4 provinces. And then when that person came in to take, more senior person came in, I went down and got a province myself, so to speak. I got the position in the State Department because I knew people. I had worked on a State Department reconstruction and development team in Iraq for a year as a Department of Defense official. I then had worked on the Iraq desk at the State Department as a consultant, or more we called ourselves consultants. No difference between consultants and contractors, right? But that was my kind of pedigree for the job, as well as having been in the Pentagon with the Marine Corps, having been a company commander for the Marines in Iraq. But basically, I knew people, and I knew the man who in 2008 and into 2009, 2010 was a State Department senior officer for Afghanistan operations. And so in 2008, as the U.S. was expanding the war in Afghanistan, the State Department was expanding its operations. They began to reach out and hire people directly into the Foreign Service. And they knew me, and actually an ex-girlfriend of mine who still worked on the Afghan desk there said, why don't we get Matt? Matt would be great for this, And so honestly, so I got a direct appointment into the Foreign Service, which is pretty rare. At that point, there were only 2 of us that year who got that appointment. The other person had been Bill Richardson. Bill Richardson, former governor of Arizona, had been at the UN, I believe, his foreign policy advisor. So you really had to know somebody to get this, get those positions. And so I ended up in Afghanistan. Just a side note, because people out there who want to hear hear about some bureaucracy. It took 6 months for me to get that job, primarily because it took 6 months for the Department of Defense to transfer my security clearance from the Department of Defense to the State Department. And this is after I had worked for years, either on an embassy team with the State Department or actually been at the State Department, right? So that's the type of, it's real, the bureaucracy. And it's always good to talk about that and share that with people, because you can, a lot of times in government, no matter what it is, you can see what the answer is, but you can't get there. And I guarantee people who work at big corporations say the same thing too. It's not
I was thinking that was the case at SiriusXM. It was the case to some extent at CNN and Comedy Central as well. That's the media industry. So what was your job? Yeah. What were your responsibilities in those different provinces? And how different is one area of that country than another? Because it's always, been said that it's very tribal and easier to understand. It's very different one area to another, from the topography, the actual land, the mountains, to the kind of the natural resources, timber, et cetera, or a lack of arable farmland, all kinds of different. It's a very diverse country. What was your job, and what was the diversity of the country like?
Well, first, the diversity, it's very diverse. But to put a caveat on that before we go any further, I've never met an Afghan who has not self-identified as an Afghan first.
Okay.
So even though it's very diverse and even though it's very localized, they still identify as Afghans.
Right.
The diversity went down to the valley and village level. We used to use a term called valleyism as opposed to nationalism, because people were concerned what happened in their valleys. People would speak their own languages in their valleys. No joke. That's what in the Korengal Valley, which in 2009 was the deadliest place for U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Time magazine it was on the cover of Time magazine. It's a valley of death, all kinds of things. You go to the Korengal, which is a valley that was, 15 to 20 miles long, a few miles wide. They spoke their own language in that valley. They spoke Korengali. They never came out of that valley. I mean, we shouldn't have been sending soldiers in. We should have been sending anthropologists in. I mean, so the idea that degree of localization of valleyism was something that was, even though it was understood, it was lost on the American strategy. I mean, this idea that we are going to put the entire nation under a central government. And in the case of the Korengal, where the insurgency in the Korengal begins, is when the Afghan government, brought in by the American military, comes in the Korengal and says to the Korengalis, and they primarily subsisted on timber trade, all these trees that your grandfathers, your great-grandfathers, your great-great-grandfather, et cetera, cut down and have lived off of, they don't belong to you. They belong to the Afghan government, and you need to pay taxes on them. So you see in many parts of the country, it becomes almost like a tax dispute. But along with that, you have to recognize that this war has been going on since the 1970s, at least since 1978, more appropriately, I think, since 1973, when the king was supposed, which is the same year I was born, to give you an idea of how long this thing has been going on, right? Yeah. And throughout the war, whether it was the Soviets or the Americans, there was a strategy of divide and conquer. So just as when the United States went into Iraq and we were going to pit the Shia versus Sunnis versus the Kurds in order to try and divide and conquer, right, to control, we did the same thing in Afghanistan. The Soviets did the same thing in Afghanistan. And so now you have a country that is naturally diverse, but that everyone identifies as Afghans, split along lines that are, by rural, urban, conservative, modern, secular, religious, but also among ethnic groups too. But that's really has changed in the last couple of years, because up until this week, these last couple of months, we did not see support outside of the Pashtun population for the Taliban like we are seeing right now. You're seeing the Taliban take over provinces without a shot fired, or with only a few shots fired, in provinces that are primarily non-Pashtun, that are made up of Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazara, et cetera. And so, what has occurred these last few years is that divide and conquer strategy that the United States was using has become so brutal because of the corruption, the predatory nature of the government and in the military we created there. It has basically overwhelmed and overcome those ethnic divisions, those regional divisions that had existed, because as I was saying, we're seeing right now with the Taliban success, many non-Pashtuns supporting them. And up until a few years ago, the Taliban was almost primarily a Pashtun movement. Again, a consequence of divide and conquer strategy used by both the Americans and the Soviets. My job there was, at least as I understood it, going there in 2009, was to work as a political officer. That was my title. And the idea being that I am going to go there along with other political officers, and we will meet with people. Some of it will be, I will work with my governor. We use that term. I think that's a lot of it too, is 12 years later, I'm still saying things like my governor, right? I mean, the ownership, the entitlement that we have as Americans, even though I've got, people who can't hear, you've got my Free Assange poster on the wall behind me, right? But here lefty Matt Ho is still saying my governor. Right. So, I think there's so much baked into us and inculcated into us. But, so some of it was what we were going to be there to help teach the Afghans how to be good practitioners of governance, right? How to teach them how to be Democrats, right, with a small d, teach them all the values of Jefferson and Madison and Lincoln and such, right? But also, too, I understood my job was to be as the political arm of the United States, and that meant negotiating and dealing with the insurgency. And that occurred. The insurgency would come in and try and speak with us in 2009, just as they have been doing for years. And this is well documented now. If people are still under the impression that the Taliban did not want to negotiate, and that's why the United States was forced to escalate the war in 2009, that's been disemboweled, kicked aside, and buried by so much documentation. The New York Times in 2016, I believe, wrote a great story about how in 2007, 2008, and going into 2009, the Norwegians had arranged for a peace deal with the Taliban by meeting directly with Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, who, according to people in the West, all the experts in the West, had never met with a Westerner before, right? So, I mean, just our understanding of Afghanistan and who the insurgency was so flawed. But this notion that they wouldn't talk to us was complete BS, because they would come in. And then what my instructions back from the embassy would be, that's not your job. The reconciliation, as we called any type of peace process negotiation, reconciliation is strictly an Afghan matter, and it has to be done by the Afghan government. The Afghan government that we were propping up, keeping in power, who had everything to lose by ever talking to the insurgency, right? I mean, the Afghan government that was composed of warlords, drug lords, traditional rivals, the same people who have been fighting the Taliban for decades, who were losing the war in 2001 until the United States came in and took the Taliban out of power and put these guys in power. Oh, yeah, okay, they're the ones who are going to really faithfully and honestly go through with a negotiation process, right? I mean, so that was kind of the gist of it. And I was there for 5 months. So much of what I saw in Afghanistan was what I'd seen in Iraq. My hopes that somehow the Obama administration was going to be different, completely dashed, no difference. You know, I mean, the war in Afghanistan was being escalated for the glory of the presidency, basically, just as the war in Iraq had been launched for the glory of George Bush. And I don't think that's just me saying that. Go back and look what the Washington Post published in December 2019 in the Afghan paper series, which is really great work by the Post. That's their conclusion. The conclusion of the Washington Post, after looking at what 600 various U.S. government and military officials said about the war in Afghanistan, was that the war in Afghanistan always has been and always will be about domestic U.S. political concerns. So after 5 months being there, I was also intellectually and morally broken, as I've discussed with you plenty of times. I had lots of issues with the wars in terms of moral injury, what's called PITS, perpetrator-induced traumatic stress, as well as PTSD. And so I was broken. So after 5 months, I couldn't do it any longer, and came home, and then through a series of Forrest Gump-like accidents, I ended up talking to the Washington Post, and that's how I know you.
And so many other people in the media who never lost track of you and are reaching out anytime Afghanistan is an important issue, or the military in general, because of your courage to resign when you thought that the mission was lost. But what do you, just to simplify it, because we don't have a ton of time left and we can talk forever, I know, but you're in high demand right now and it's Sunday and I appreciate your time. But when a lot of people are trying to understand, what the mission ever was and why we were there and stuff, but instead of going to renegotiate or litigate the why we went there, if the goal was to train a military, and the idea was we spent like $80 billion over almost 20 years and trained 300,000 Afghan military, and this president, his Secretary of State, had said it would be months at the soonest that the Taliban would take over. What seems to be the story, Matt, unfolding over the past few days and weeks, is all of those guys we trained, whose time we gave tons of time to and equipment to, and obviously American taxpayer money, they didn't fight. They laid down their arms. They just they didn't necessarily want to die. Whatever, I don't know. But the point being, the other important point here is, general after general is quoted as saying, we're training these guys, it's going well, more and more of them are being trained, and whether it's police or Afghan army, and plenty of reason why they would want to quit, because they were getting killed while they're standing in line to sign up and so on and so forth. But what is your kind of analysis of what's happened over the past, year? From a lot of people want to look at the politics of it. I'm interested in that. I certainly am, from Trump to Biden, but I'm kind of more interested in what happened with the U.S. military and the training of the Afghan military, and why our own experts and intelligence thought that somehow the capital of Afghanistan at least would hold, much less other cities.
First, just to get back to one thing about the presidents. When I resigned, Chuck Hagel, who at that time was co-chair along with David Boren, who had also been a U.S. senator, were co-chairs of the President's Intelligence Advisory Board. And I had to go in and give testimony to them. because Hagel said, my concern is that the president of the United States is not hearing anything near the truth about Afghanistan. He said, I remember Hagel saying this to me. At that point, Hagel was teaching at Georgetown. He says, how come what you said is no different than what all these captains and majors and lieutenant colonels who are taking classes at Georgetown are saying? But when I go and I look at what the intelligence, what's being put on the president's desk, nowhere near that, nowhere like that. And I think the same was for Bush, and I'm sure the same was for Biden. I guarantee you Biden has no clue about what the actual sum and total of the Afghan forces are like. If you went to Biden right now, I guarantee you in good faith, and anyone who knows me knows I'm not a fan of Joe Biden, but on this issue, I believe he believes that there are 350,000 men and women in the Afghan security forces who have been trained, who have been well equipped, who have received the benefit of $88 billion in U.S. funding, plus how many, all the other, the lives of thousands of Americans who were lost over there, and of course the lives of hundreds of thousands of Afghans. But, so how much information does he actually get, that's accurate? Does he know that roughly, anywhere from 30 to 50% of that 350,000 men and women are ghost soldiers? They're padding on payroll. I don't think he gets that. I don't think he knows that because no one tells him
What does that mean, ghost soldiers and padding on payroll?
It means that they simply don't exist, that it's just a way for commanders to pocket money. Look, in 2014, when Mosul fell to the Islamic State, and the same questions are being asked about the Iraqi army, right? Patrick Coburn, who has a longtime war correspondent, he wrote this really great expose describing how the Iraqi army is not an army, it's a business venture. And that's what it has been in Afghanistan as well. When you build a corrupt system, when you build a patronage network, which is what the army is, where the men at the top take from those below, and it just keeps going all the way down. And then when you have a country where 70% of the Afghan population lives on less than $1 a day. So next time someone brings up about the great progress the United States has brought up to Afghanistan, remind them of that. But, when you have that, and you have then Afghans who are facing this Taliban offensive that, as I just was reading some journalism coming out of the region, a senior, what was he? He's been a member of both the Karzai and Ghani governments, and I'm blanking on his name right now, but he's basically given this interview that says, look, what's occurred in the last few weeks in Afghanistan is not the result of weeks. It's the result of negotiations over months and years in some cases. So when you see, if you're an Afghan soldier who's there because you're getting $200 a month, which again, most of Afghanistan, 70% of Afghanistan lives on $1 a day, you're doing it to help your family survive. And all of a sudden that money doesn't show up anymore because as well as your leaders are all switching sides and going to the Taliban, of course you're going to put your weapon down and walk away. Why are you going to die for those people? Particularly when you were there for reasons of sustenance, of sustainment, of trying to keep your family alive. It makes no sense when you're not going to get that money. And that's what happened when you build a system like this, a corrupt system like this. When it gets threatened, any of the money that actually is reaching these soldiers and policemen and policewomen, because there are women in the security forces in Afghanistan, not many, but some. When that gets threatened, that money gets turned off. So I guarantee for the last couple of months, 2-3 months, these soldiers have not been receiving pay. Right. And of course, as soon as the Taliban show up and their commanders have switched sides and you've got a choice, all right, and for what we're seeing, there has been revenge in Afghanistan. And anyone who is pointing out the executions and stuff in Afghanistan as singular atrocities without understanding the history of this war and the giant revenge cycle that it has been for 50 years now, basically. Of course, but the fact that we're not seeing atrocities of a scale that will remind us of earlier times in this war shows the degree that this takeover by the Taliban has been something that has been going on for years now, and that Biden removing the troops, the Taliban were just waiting for that moment because they wanted to make sure that the United States was fully gone. If Biden had not removed the troops, the same thing would have occurred. with the possibility of the United States staying longer. But that's my take on it, is that it's got really, I mean, because you're talking about Biden removing 2,500 troops in a country the size of Texas. Do people really think those 2,500 troops were what was holding back from all these, the entire nation collapsing in the period of this defensive has taken place over 8 days, basically, right? So the idea that 2,500 troops meant the difference in 8 days, like that's, you know, the Soviet Union, after they left, that government held on for 3 years. And it only collapsed because the Soviet Union itself collapsed.
What do you make of the people, women's rights activists, those who have worked there, that think that it's been triumphant how women have returned to schools and gained far better rights, gotten positions in the government and other professional positions as teachers and so on, and the concern for them, given your opinion, given your analysis, your understanding of the country and of human rights, what do you make of those people who are really terrified and even outraged at the Biden administration for pulling out, saying that you're leaving these people behind?
Yeah, what I would say is unless you've been advocating for women over the last 20 years in Afghanistan, you're just repeating pro-war talking points coming out of London and D.C. Look, the reality for women in Afghanistan has been brutal. Maybe it's been a different form of brutality under the Taliban. It hasn't been as theatrical. It hasn't been as terrible in some ways. But look, as many as 80% of Afghan women are forced into marriage. 80%. That's under the government. Most of them are child brides. I mean, it's legal in Afghanistan to rape your wife. 80% of the women, 80% of the people who kill themselves in Afghanistan, or are killed by suicide, I should say, are women. That completely flips the suicide. There's nowhere else in the world where you've got that type of disparity. In most of the world, men are primarily commit suicide. In Afghanistan, life is so bad for women. You can find a soldier or a Marine who spent time not in Kabul, but out in a province someplace, and very likely they will tell you during their 8 months, 12 months, however long, they never saw a woman at all. I mean, I in 5 months in Afghanistan, besides for the women I met in Kabul, in the 5 other provinces I was in where I spent most of the time, I saw 2 women, I remember. That's it. And these were under U.S. controlled, Afghan government controlled areas. Because what it is, it's not, yes, the Taliban are worse as an aggregate than the culture, but the culture is really bad. The very people that the United States put into power in 2001, the warlords, they're the ones who brought the burqa to Kabul, not the Taliban. By the time the Taliban takes Kabul, the burqa's already been forced on the women of Kabul for 2 years by the very warlords that we put back into power. But I mean, and I'm not denying that in some areas, in some parts of Afghanistan, things have gotten much better. Absolutely. Yes, I totally agree. But for 90% of Afghan women, there has been no real change. What we know about the stories about girls going to school because of work like by journalists like Azmat Khan or by the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, John Sopko, is that those were just stories that, you know, I mean, they didn't exist. 80 to 90% of the schools the United States claimed it built in Afghanistan cannot be found. Cannot be found. The U.S. government itself, through the Special Inspector General, has gone out looking for these schools, and they can't find them. Journalists have done the same kind of work. So a lot of this has just been war propaganda, crocodile tears, basically. And I think the main conclusion is that even if the Taliban were worse than what has gone on in the last 20 years, which I think you can make the argument for, but it's a difference of degrees. Right. Yes. I mean, did this government execute women in stadiums? No. But who does, and I know people are now going to say, oh, this is whataboutism. But, we sell the Saudis hundreds of billions of dollars and they stone to death women for adultery. The government does. I mean, so there's the idea that there's some kind of principle behind this and has been for the last 20 years is it's just not there. And the main point, though, I think the point is that, and I wrote about this in Newsweek last week or 2 weeks ago or whenever it was, I titled it A Cruel and Unjust Peace. And it is. It's a cruel and unjust peace. But I think for most women in Afghanistan, the primary concern, the last 20 years has been their children being killed by roadside bombs, being killed because they got caught in the middle of a firefight, being killed because a bomb dropped on their house, as opposed to other aspects of life. You know, and I remember the same thing that Iraqis would say the same thing too. Iraqis would say, yeah, yes, under Saddam, life was no picnic. You know, it was, you know, but there was no chance of my child getting killed because he or she was walking across the street and a car bomb went off. You know, no chance that my children are going to get killed because a militia from another ethnicity showed up and started shooting people at a soccer match. You know what I mean? Like things like that. So I think, yeah, we rightly should be concerned. And we rightly should be calling on the United States government to do everything in its power. But the idea that somehow there's only two choices for Afghan women, to bomb them or abandon them, is really flawed. I mean, like, it just really does not, you know, it doesn't hold up. And there are other things, you know, there are things we could have been doing. This issue with the refugees, U.S. veterans groups and human rights groups and journalists have been screaming up and down about translators and people who've worked for the U.S. and for other organizations since at least 2013. Since at least 2013, probably even earlier. 2013 is when the Obama administration starts to bring troops back from Afghanistan. So this has been something that people have been jumping up and down for 8 years. Why didn't the U.S. government the U.S. government have a plan in place? We knew this was going to happen. As a friend of mine said on a panel we were just on, perhaps the only thing that the United States did worse than the occupation of Afghanistan was the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Right. And I think you can be both in support of withdrawing from Afghanistan, ending the war, and still saying, like, but the reality is that, you know, the United States built this kleptocracy, it built this brutal government, and it was a house of cards. And has anyone ever seen a house of cards, you know, get dismantled slowly? It collapses. And that's the way it's always been and always would have been. And, you know, so it's the most important thing now going forward is how does a peace in terms of a ceasefire be sustained? No concerns about victory, no concerns about defeat, but what can be done to keep violence from blowing up again in Afghanistan? Because presumably as the Taliban are successful, violence will drop, right? So you have a cruel and unjust peace. But what can you then do to help the Afghan people? I mean, in a real way, you know, in terms of economic release, food assistance, you know, infrastructure development, et cetera. And then from that, I believe, because you have a ceasefire, because people aren't killing each other, and because violence is a spiraling cycle, you then can have progress.
What do you make of, final question, 20 years after 9/11, the Taliban will be in control of Afghanistan again? You resigned in 2009, right? Yeah. From your senior position at the State Department, and you wrote this very poignant, so well-written letter, much about the American fighting forces and what they've lost and what promises had been broken. What do you say to those who fought in Afghanistan, who served in the U.S. military at this point?
You know, I've seen a lot. I've seen a change, I think, in fellow veterans, their attitudes towards it.
Yeah,
when the United States pulled out of Iraq, say, at the end of 2011, and then, of course, when the Islamic State took over parts of Iraq after that in 2013, 14, a lot of anger in veterans, a lot of feelings of betrayal. And now I think it's more about, I hear more wanting to hold American leaders account, right? You know, along the lines of like, fool me once, shame on you, right? Fool me twice, shame on me, you know, in the sense of like, okay, these same people have been propagating these wars. The same thing keeps happening, and there's no accountability. There's no justice on the American side for what's occurred there. And you're already seeing the revisionism in the Washington Post today. And Michelle Flournoy, who led the Center for New American Security, which was the think tank behind the Obama escalation of the war in 2009, who then went on to become the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under the Obama administration at the Defense Department, the third, right, who testified countless times to Congress under oath how well the war in Afghanistan is going. In the Washington Post today, Flournoy is saying, oh, I knew back in 2010 this wasn't going to work, and we all knew it wasn't going to work. I mean, so where's the accountability? And I think that gets to the point, I think, about media. And I think that we are changing in this country with regards to the media. People like you are having success and you're building and you're, as we talked earlier before, you're accountable to yourself. And you have, I know you have a degree of heart and conscience that is tied to the work you do. And the work you do is a reflection of truth and honesty as Pete Dominick sees it. There's no other layer in there, I believe. And there are many others who have their YouTube programs and podcasts and whatnot. But what you see with the major media is a refusal to be accountable. Who was the one who have been these people for the last 2 decades saying how well the war has been going? It's been the media. And so I brought up the Afghan papers before, and just now in this month, the Washington Post, the author of that is Greg Whitlock, is putting out a book on the Afghan papers, which I'm sure will be terrific.
Yeah, if people don't know what the Afghan papers are, look it up. It's basically a big leak about what we were, as a huge story and scoop that the Washington Post got, compared to the Pentagon papers and other similar leaks. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, but you look at the book, look who's blurbing the book, right? Go to the dust jacket. Who's blurbing the book? It's the major media Pentagon correspondents. Huh. It's Tom Bowman from NPR. It's Barbara Starr from the Pentagon. Barbara Starr was at the Pentagon when I was in the Pentagon in 2002. You know what I mean? So the very same people who went along with these lies, who were either too dumb or they were in on it. Because after decades of covering the Pentagon, of hearing officials saying the war is going well, and then a year later it's not going well, and hearing the same things over again, well, either you're too dumb or you're in on it. And so the fact that the Washington Post could publish this amazing book documenting in incredible detail how the war in Afghanistan was one big systemic lie from start until now, and it's blurred by the very same people who were repeating the lies. Hey, I was thinking about this earlier, Pete, and I'll wrap it up with this. You had your show on CNN for a little bit back in 2010, and I was a guest. That's right. I remember you calling me one time before I was a guest, and you were pissed. And it was because you have been instructed that you would have to have an independent, non-biased expert on to counter me, to balance me, right?
Yeah, that's right. This guy from the Brookings Institution.
Yeah, and because I guess I'm biased or whatever, even though I was unemployed at the time, quit because
this guy. No, I know. The guy from the Brookings.
And just so people to understand who they put on, they put on Michael O'Hanlon, who has a very public relationship in terms of friendship with generals, including General Petraeus, whose writings and support and cheerleading for the wars is voluminous and was certainly the catalog of it in 2010 was well available to them. And so not just his spin on the wars, his lying about the wars, but the fact that year after year he was wrong about everything. Yeah. And most importantly, his organization, he worked for Brookings Institution, an organization that has taken millions of dollars from the Pentagon, from the State Department, from the intelligence services, from the fossil fuel companies, from the defense companies, right? So this was the fair and balanced person that, you had to have on your show in order to counter what I was saying because I couldn't be trusted.
And I'm going to find that clip. I think I have it somewhere, and maybe try to post the audio of it at the end of our interview if I can find it. Also, that was the episode that was I think the 10th anniversary of the invasion and occupation of the Iraq War, and of Afghanistan rather. And I was also instructed by my producers at the time that I was not allowed to use video of American servicemen in their flag draped coffins coming home. You weren't allowed to show that. I was trying to show the cost of war, and that was an image. They said, no, we don't want to do that. We could get in trouble from corporate,
Yeah, no, it is. It's the the things I've learned and seen about the media. And you had said that I was in demand, and yes, I have been in demand this last week, especially. But it's all been from journalists like yourself. Who are doing their independent alternative. The only major corporate media that has reached out to me in the last week has been from Britain and from Australia.
Oh, interesting. No American.
No. The Washington Post. The Washington Post, who, people can Google it or whatever, look it up, the story on me, the Washington Post ran. It was a 3,000-word biopic, above the fold, front page expose on me. They sink enormous amount of capital into me running this story. And then since then, they have never contacted me. Right. And we can do a whole other show about this, but I had experiences, where what happens is that General Petraeus in Central Command hires a strategic communications firm to discredit me. And that's why your producer was told, because they would have gotten an email basically from Central Command, from General Petraeus' command saying, look, this guy is unbiased. I had this happen with Dan Rather. Dan Rather brought me up. He used to be doing that show he'd have that show on whatever cable channel it was years ago. He brought me up to New York, interviewed me for like 3.5 hours. During our B-roll walking around the city, he says to me, I know you're right about Afghanistan because I've been going there for 3 decades, so I know you're right. And then right when I'm leaving, his producer comes up and says, hey, we just got this email, and it's from this firm representing Central Command. And it basically says, to paraphrase it, if you work with a guy like this, we won't work with you.
Oh,
and then honest to God, like a few weeks later, when the episode airs, I'm nowhere to be seen.
No way.
Well, who's all throughout the story, that hour-long news program on the surge in Afghanistan, all kinds, General McChrystal's there, all kinds of access. So I think there's a lot to it. I mean, I think people, if they're not, maybe you've had her on, Ariana Bakari.
I don't think so.
She resigned from MSNBC last year as a matter of conscience. She said ratings-based media is killing this country. Oh, yeah. And she has all kinds of she works at Columbia Journalism Review. She has all kinds of sometimes it's just simply, it's not as sinister and as insidious as a guy like me wants it to be. Sometimes it's simply because, that story on Paris Hilton is definitely going to play better than some dude with a beard talking about Afghanistan.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, so there's some of that too.
There's no doubt about it. I know you got to go do another hit. Thank you very much for talking to me, and let's talk again really soon, Bill. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pete.
Stand up. Matthew Ho. One time I went down to Washington, D.C. and brought him out and grabbed a few too many drinks, probably, and then walked around the United States Capitol. Yeah, that one. And had an amazing conversation with him. We got really close over the years, and he's always been super supportive of me and followed my career, my family. I just love that guy. So it was great to catch up with him. Who else should I be talking to on the everything surrounding Afghanistan? I definitely will be reaching out to a lot of my contacts and friends that I've spoken to over the past few years covering this. So many good books I've read about it. Like I said, I'll have Spencer Ackerman on the Thursday show, and also Matthew Ho is set to join us at the Hangout on Thursday night at 8 o'clock as well. So don't miss that. If you're not already a subscriber to the show, then sign up right now and join us at Thursdays at 8 p.m. this week. Matthew Ho is set to join us. Just go to patreon.com/Pete Dominic or go to the paid subscription link in the show notes. That's all for today. I am taking Ava back up to camp for one more week of counselor and training, and so I'll be driving all day. Should have some interesting news for you on the Tuesday show. I hope you'll tune into that. Thank you for listening today. It's now time for singer-songwriter, stand-up supporter, and subscriber, the great Jon Carroll, Emmy Award-winning Jon Carroll, to sing us out as he does every day with his hit song, You Gotta Stand Up.
So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence, even if it ain't a very friendly audience. Well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense and you stand up. Stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. While you lying awake wondering where the money all went, it'll be the cost of freedom now. seed of that experiment. If you stand up, all right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand